we have a very special sikha. It's the second sikha for this week. Yisro, it's from Lamed Aleph, Krach Lamed Aleph, volume 31, Sikha Aleph, the first sikha on Yisro. Sif Aleph. Ala pasuk Kaisamer lebeis Yaakov v'sagid lebnei Yisrael. On the verse, so you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the children of Israel. Isa b'mechilta, the Mechilta writes, Kaisamer lebeis Yaakov elu hanashim. That when the Torah says you should say this to the house of Jacob, these are the women. The Sagid Livnei Yisrael, and you shall say this to the children of Israel, Elu Anashim, these are the men. Davar Acher, another thing. The Mechilta says, Koisamer lebeis Yaakov b'lashon raka, and mar rashi devarim linnashim. So you shall say to the house of Jacob. Here, it's referring not to who the demographic is, but how the information should be transmitted. And it should be in a Lashon Raka, which can be defined as a soft language. And then the Mechilta says you should tell them the Rashi Devarim. You should tell them the headlines. You should tell them like the main points. V'sagi livnei Yisrael, and you shall tell Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, v'tedaktek imahim. And you should be punctilious with them, and you should give them the details. V'tzarich biur. The Rebbe says we have to understand. Milashon mechilta davar acher chulei muchach sheyesh kan shnei perushim. From the terminology that is used, where the Mechilta gives us one piece of information, then says davar acher, another thing. Usually, this means that we're being given two different explanations or ways of understanding the same thing. But the Rebbe says, "V'tamua," this is a wonder. Mahem shnei hapirushim b'kasu. What are the two ways of understanding the verse? It seems that it's not two ways of understanding the verse. It is harei ela shnei inyanim sheinim, but rather the Mechilta is addressing two different details. Dibatchila mefarish mihem beis Yaakov v'bnei Yisrael elu hanashim elu anashim. The first part of the Mechilta seems to be addressing the cohort, the demographic. Who's getting this information? And it tells us that Beis Yaakov refers to the women and Bnei Yisrael refers to the men. And then afterwards, in the second part of the Mechilta, Mefarish Oifen Hadibor LeBeis Yaakov. Then the second part deals with how this information should be broadcasted, how the information should be imparted. And he says that for the women, it should be B'lashon Raka. It should be with a soft language. Va'ifin hadibur lebnei Yisrael, and the way that you speak to the men, tedaktik imohim. You should be specific and punctilious with them. Then the Rebbe compares and contrasts this with the Medrash. V'hine b'Medrash Rabbah, another Medrash. The Mechilta tells us one thing, and the Medrash Rabbah tells us on the same pasuk, ala pasuk, on this very same verse, Isa, the Medrash says, Koisamer lebeis Yaakov. So you shall say to the house of Jacob, Elu hanashim, these are the women. Amar loi, Hashem said to Moshe, Emor lahem rashi devarim, sheheim yecholetz l'shmaya. Give them the headlines, give them the most overarching theme or the basics or the generalities that they are able to listen, that they are able to cognitively ingest. V'sagid lebnei Yisrael, and then when it says, and you shall say this to the children of Israel, Elu anashim, these are the men. Amar loi, Hashem said to Moshe, and more lahem, you should say to them, dikduke devarim, shehem yichalin l'shmaya. You should say to them the details that they are able to hear. Ulafum reheta, and in truth, nira shezeu keperish hasheni b'mechilta. It seems like the second part of the like the Medrash is aligning with the second part of the Mechilta, or it's a combination of what the Mechilta is teaching in the two parts. But the Rebbe says it's actually not that way. If you look a little bit more closely, V'yesh lahavin kavanas hamedrash. And so we're going to do this by trying to understand what is the intention of the medrash. Why do we see that the medrash is telling us something very different from the Mechilta? Because first of all, Aleph, Shemashmit Haloshin B'Loshin Raka, the medrash leaves out this idea of Loshin Raka, of a soft language. It deletes that. And Beis, Meisiv Shehein Yecholos L'Shmaya, V'chein Eitala Anashiv Meisiv Shehein Yecholin L'Shmaya. And it adds something, and that is that you should speak to them in the way that they can hear. Both women and men, the Medrash repeats these words, shehem or shehain. The men is shehem, the women are shehain, yecholis or yecholin lishmaya. What they can hear, what they can take into their system. Ulechayra, nira da mechilta b'medrash pligema amar Moshe l'nashim. And so now, when you look at it a little bit more closely, you see that there's actually a plukta. There's an argument. There's a difference of opinion on what Moshe told the women, because the Lahamedrash Amar Lahin Rak Rashi Dvarim. According to the Medrash, what Moshe said to the women were the headlines, the basics, the most important aspects. And according to the Mechilta, he said, or he also said, soft words. And the super commentaries explain that what are soft words? Words of appeasement, or words that would placate the women. Kilaymar, what would make it more ingestible or palatable. Hasbaras milas mitzvahs, to explain to the women how great the mitzvahs are, b'schar kiyuman, and how great is the reward for keeping them. And in the brackets, the Rebbe says v'yesh lahosif, and we should add shemi perish Rashi ala Torah mashma. So now the Rebbe is bringing in Rashi. So we had the Mechilta, we had the Medrash, and now we have Rashi. And the Rebbe says we should add that according to the parish of Rashi, mashma, it's understood, the lashon raka koilel shnei inyanim, that the terminology that the Mechilta uses about how it should be said to the women, that it should be said b'lashon raka, could mean two things. Hein divrei pius, it could mean words of appeasement or placation, or v'hein rashi dvarim, and or it could mean just giving them the basics, the brass tacks, the headlines. Shagam heim nikraim lashon raka, because rashi dvarim, just giving like the most important bullet points, can also be called a soft language, kibon shakal lahavinam, because the bullet points are easy to understand without kind of bringing in all the details and all the exposition and the elaboration. The Rebbe says, and this is the exact words of Rashi on this pasuk. Leveis Yaakov elu hanashim. When the Torah says Veis Yaakov, this is talking about the women. Toimar lahen b'lashon raka. You should speak to them in a soft language. This tagid livnei Yisrael, but you should tell the children of Israel, to the men, you should impart einshin v'diktukin. You should tell them about the punishments. You tell them about all the details. That pirish lascharim. This you should explain to the men, and in which way? Dvarim hakashin kegidin. Words that are as tough or as strong as sinews. Hainu, meaning. So what does this mean? Aleph. Shaloi pirish de lashon raka. It emerges when we look at Rashi, comparing and contrasting to the Mechilta and to the Medrash. Rashi does not elaborate on what lashon raka means, and Beis, when it comes to the men, under Tagid Livnei Yisrael, he does say Kasav. He wrote Einshin B'Diktukim. that you should tell them about the punishment and you should give them the details. Umashma. So then it's understood. So although Rashi doesn't delineate exactly what he means by Lashon Raka, but we can infer the opposite of what he says about the men, that it should be about Einshin V'Dikdukim. So it would seem that according to Rashi, Aleph, Lashon Raka means Hafchan Shel Einshin, the opposite of talking about punishments, the Hainu She'amar Scharan Shel Mitzvahs. He told them about the rewards, and Beis Hafchan Shel Dikdukim, and the opposite of all the details. Rak Amira V'Dibar Kloliim Klal HaMitzvahs, but rather very general. V'tzarech biur, and we have to explain Tam Pluktas HaMechilta VaHaMedrash. We have to look at what is the difference of opinion between the Mechilta, the Medrash, Im Arma Lenashim Rak Rashi Devarim, Oisha Amar Gam Devarim Rakim Al Derech Schar Mitzvahs. So Rashi, by implication, includes both of these, but we have to understand that Mechilta seems to be saying one, the Medrash seems to be saying the other, and what is the underpinning of their difference of opinion between if Lashon Raka means Rashi Devarim, just the bullet points, or Sha'amar Devarim Rakim, that it means that he spoke to them in a way of appeasement, and therefore he spoke to them about the schar and how good it would be, etc. Gam yesh l'dayek. We also have to drill down on the fact shebemedrash matchil elu hanashim va'achar kach mefarit amor lahem rashi dvarim chulei. V'chein b'sagel b'nei Yisro mefarish tchila elu hanashim va'achar kach mefarit teichen hadiburim and mor lahem diktu dvarim. In the medrash, first it tells you which cohort is being addressed. It tells you which demographic, who Beis Yaakov stands for, who Bnei Yisrael stands for, and then it tells you in which way the words were spoken. But in the Mechilta, in the second Pirush, Matchil B'Teichen Hadvorim. The second part of the Mechilta begins with describing the manner in which the information was imparted, the way in which the information was transmitted. V'Lashon Raka, and then he's Messiah. First, he says how it was. So, for instance, about the women, that it was a softer language. And then he concludes with saying this was to the women. So these
Excuse me, Rivky. Can you check and see if your volume is all the way up? Some of us are having trouble hearing you.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. I'm going to try to see where I could adjust that. Let me try to bring the device closer to me. Does this sound any better, Mashi?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
When you lean in, it's easier to hear.
What'd you say?
When you're leaning in, it's easier to hear.
Okay, I will lean in because I'm kind of afraid to touch anything and ruin it. So I'm going to lean in. This is better, Tippa? Okay, Beis. Okay, so the Rebbe introduces us to the Mechilta, to the Medrash, to the Rashi on these iconic words, and shows us how there are, differences in the way that they are addressing both who are these two demographics, and also the difference in the Torah. One is Emor and one is Sagid, and what that means. And now we're going to go deeper into this. Beis. The Shleimar Nekudas Habir Bazeh. And the Rebbe says we might say that the central point of explanation is as follows. Shnei hapirushim b'mechilta chalukim b'hatam shenyane haTorah nemru b'shnei oifanim. The two parts of the Mechilta are divided in addressing the reason why Torah was given in two different ways. Toimar v'sagid. Those are the two words that are used, and we understand that it's telling us that the Torah was transmitted two different ways. And the Mechilta is addressing this, and is addressing this in two different ways. The Perush Harishain, the first part of the Mechilta, is addressing Sibas, his Chalkozu, Imitzad Mikable Hatera. The first part of the Mechilta is addressing who was in receipt of the Torah, so that the differences have to do with who it is that is receiving the Torah. Elu Hanashim, Elu Ha'anashim. So the Mechilta tells us that Tamar is addressing women, Zagid is addressing men. The Achiluk betchunas nafsham shel nashim va'anashim hevi shnei oifanim sugim b'mesiras divrei Torah. That because there is a difference in the soul of women from men, therefore the Torah was transmitted in two modalities, in two ways, in two categories. Masha Enkain, the Perish Hasheni, but in contradistinction, the second part of the Mechilta is addressing Hachiluk ba'ofen mesiras haTorah yesodei v'hachefza shel hadivrei Torah. So the first part of the Mechilta was discussing the Gavra, who is receiving the Torah, and the second part of the Mechilta is talking about the words of the Torah themselves and how they are being transmitted. Why? Nidrash mitzad Torah, because the Torah itself needs to be transmitted in two different ways. What are the two different ways? Shetchila tzrichim limsar rashi dvarim. First, you have to impart generalities. Virak achar kach is hadiktukim, and then you have to drill down on the details. Dippa, you're smiling, and I'm trying to read the smile. Okay, but the sound is okay. Okay,
Sound is fine.
I'm not too close to the screen so that all you see is my nose. Okay.
I just feel bad doing that to you.
No. I'm glad that Mashi said something, because what's the point in it being hard? Okay, so the Rebbe is saying that the Mechilta is in the second part telling us something about the Chefza. It's telling us something about the Torah, not about who's receiving it, but about how you teach Torah. First, you have to teach generalities, and then you have to teach the detail. And then the pasuk adds, that these two aspects of the Torah are divided among the two cohorts that are Mikable HaTorah, that are receiving the Torah. Koi Soimar, which is Lashon Raka and Rashi Devarim, that terminology, so you shall say, which infers or which alludes to soft language and giving the generalities, that should be said, Leveis Yaakov, to the women. V'sagid, and what should be transmitted to Bnei Yisrael, to the men, v'tidaktik imohim. And you should be punctilious or detailed or maybe even more strict with them. And once we understand this, that there are two things that are being addressed, both who is receiving the Torah and that there are two aspects of Torah, so then we can say, Shahamedrash loy asi, kefi shamashram b'shitchias haloshin keperish hasheni b'mechilta, that the Medrash is actually not coming to agree or is not really aligned with the second aspect of the Mechilta, which seems to be the case when you look at it superficially. Ela adraba, on the contrary, mifarish umivar haperish harishon b'Mechilta. If anything, the Medrash is coming to explain and to give more commentary on the first part of the Mechilta. Shatam hischalkozu, that the reason for this delineation, for the two ways of imparting the Torah, elu hanashim, elu ha'anashim, this is for women, this is for men, because it has to do with what they are able to receive, what they are able to internalize, what they are able to hear and really listen to. Kilaymar, that is to say, Mitzad HaTorah Atzma Ein hechach shetiyeh chalukah zu. According to the Medrash is saying that the Torah itself does not necessitate these two categories. Doesn't have to be that way. Ella, but because the Torah has to be imparted and transmitted to the Jews, anashim v'nashim, men and women, lachein cholak Moshe mesiras haTorah lechol sug lefi mashu yachal l'shmaya. Therefore, Moshe divided the way in which it was said in accordance with what the particular audience could internalize. And don't get bent out of shape. It's not a contradiction that the Medrash uses the same words as the Mechilta, Rashi Devarim, Umashmal Shalishnehem HaMechilta Perish Habeis VaHaMedrash Nemru Oisam Dvarim Lenashim. Don't get caught up in the fact that both the Medrash and the second part of the Mechilta are using the same words about how it was imparted to women. They're using the term Rashi Devarim, but the Rebbe is saying, Ki lo yaharei Rashi Devarim shebe Medrash, ki harei Rashi Devarim shebe Mechilta. But although they're both using the same term, they don't mean the same thing in what they're imparting. And that is important to remember. Yes, they're both using the term Rashi Devarim, but they mean two different things when they use that term. Gimel. And the Rebbe is going to amplify in this in the third part of the Sikha. Hasbaras ha'inyan, to understand this concept. Begeder Rashi Devarim, Shnei Eifanim. When you talk about Rashi Devarim, which again, we have defined as the highlights or the bullet points or the most basic ideas, this could be understood in two different ways. Aleph.
Sorry, I think someone's asking if you could just do a little summary before you go on in terms of the three different. It would be helpful for me too. Not just one.
Thank you. Yeah, because I'm not. Thanks for doing that. Because I'm not attentive to the chat right now. Okay. So the Rebbe is saying first, look back to the second paragraph in Seif Aleph in the first part of the Sikha, and the Rebbe goes through what the Mechilta says. And the Mechilta says two things. First, he says, who are the two audiences? Beis Yaakov is the women, Bnei Yisrael are the men. Then, in the second part of the Mechilta, he talks about how it was imparted. And he says, for Beis Yaakov, for the women, it was in a soft language. And for the men, it was in a way of greater detail and more maybe strictness. That's the Mechilta. The Medrash says that when it says you should say it to the women, you should tell them Rashi Devarim. You should tell them the highlights. You should tell them the bullet points. You should tell them the basics that they are able to hear. And you should tell Bnei Yisrael, the men, you should tell them the details that they are able to hear. And the Rebbe says that the Medrash doesn't bring in the words Lashon Raka, the soft language, but it does add that you should teach each demographic in the way that they can hear it. And the Rebbe says that at first blush, it appears that the Medrash is basically echoing or is aligned with the second part of the Mechilta. However, the Rebbe is going to, upend that thesis. He's going to say, no, that's not what's going on. And he also just told us that we shouldn't get tripped up by the fact that if you look back into the first paragraph, where he cites the entire Mechilta, the Mechilta uses the term Rashi Devarim, and the Medrash uses the term Rashi Devarim. And the Rebbe says, don't think they're saying the same thing. There's two different ways of understanding Rashi Devarim. We're just about to go into that. But before that, we're just going to look at what the Rebbe said about Rashi. Then the Rebbe said that we should look at what Rashi said. And let me find that. Going in the wrong direction. Okay. And Rashi says Lashon Raka, and that's how you should speak to the women. This is if you have the Hebrew Sikha printed out from the project, it's the last paragraph on the first page. Rashi says, Lebeis Yaakov Elu Hanashim, you should talk to them in Lashon Raka. And to the men, you should tell them in words that are as tough as sinews, you should tell them about the punishments, and you should tell them about the details. The Rebbe says, from this we infer that when Rashi says Lashon Raka, it means that you should tell the women the opposite of punishments. You should tell them about the schar, and you should tell them the opposite of the details, which is you should tell them in generalities. Okay. Then in Seif Beis, the Rebbe said that we have to understand that we're talking about two different things. There's two different things being addressed. There's who is being Mekabel, the Torah, and then there's Mitzad the Chefza, Mitzad the Torah. Does the Torah have to be imparted in two different ways? And the Rebbe says that actually, based on the Medrash, we're seeing that the Torah itself, it's not imperative that it should be addressed in two different ways. But once you understand that there are two different cohorts or two different demographics, then you need to align the transmission with who it is that's listening. And so for that reason, there's two modalities in the transmission. And the last thing that the Rebbe said at the end of Seif Beis was that both the Medrash and the Mechilta use the words Rashi Devarim, and he's going to explain that each one means something different. One is talking about the Chefza, the Torah, and one is more addressing who it is that's getting the information. Okay, so
Thank you. That was perfect.
Okay, good. So we're going to start again from Seif Gimel. So the Rebbe says, Begeder Rashi Devarim, in the category or under the rubric of Rashi Devarim, meaning the headlines or bullet points, Shnei Afanim, there are two ways of understanding this. There's either Aleph, the first you could say Rashi Devarim, you should understand this Al Derech Maimer Chazal, you should understand this aligned with what Chazal teach in Gemara Pesachim, La'olam Yishna Adam L'Talmidei Derech Tzara, that a teacher should always teach his students in synopsized form, succinct, short. The Rav Halaymedim Talmidei, when a Rav learns with his student, he should really constrict himself in terms of all the arguments and the back and forth and all the details. That way, if you want to impart something, don't give him every single thing you know about the subject and all the back and forth and all the details. Just be succinct. Try to organize yourself and distill all the information into an essential format that can be readily received. That's one way of understanding Rashi Devarim. Beis, there's another way of understanding Rashi Devarim. Shehem Adarabba Haklal Shamimenu Mistafim Kol Pratei Inyan, where you're giving somebody the essence of the information from which all of the other details will be extrapolated. So, if I'm understanding this correctly, the first way of understanding Rashi Devarim is kind of almost you're dumbing it down, quote unquote. In the second way of understanding Rashi Devarim, you're talking to somebody who doesn't need to be spoon-fed in elongated form. You tell them the Rashi Devarim, you give them the bullet points, and they can already extract all of the details that come out of the bullet point. Valderech Lashon Mishnah, and it's like the very cryptic form that the Mishnah is written in. Shu Davar Katzer v'Chelel Inyanim Rabim. The Mishnah is very, very short, but it includes a tremendous amount of information. Shakol Protei Hashakal B'Tayr Shebigemara near Mazin B'Lashon Mishnah. All the back and forth, the pages and pages and folio of the Gemara are all just extrapolating from, and they're all alluded to in the very, very terse terminology of the Mishnah. Okay, so there are two different ways of understanding the same words, Rashi Devarim. Either try to simplify, because that way you'll be able to get your point across, because too much detail is going to be overload. It's going to overwhelm. Or using the term Rashi Devarim could be code for you don't need to go into a lot of detail because the person you're talking to gets it. They'll be able to take all the detail out of it without you having to say it all. Now, we find regarding Matan Torah, Shebetchila nitnu aseres hadibros, shehem klolos kol haTorah kula, the whole Torah Mrs. Bechlal aseres hadibros heim. First, the Eibusher gave just 10 bullet points, aseres hadibros, and they include all of the Torah. All the 613 mitzvahs are included in that. Ubezeh gufa, and then within that aseres hadibros, rak shnei dibros harishonos. And of the 10 bullet points, they only heard 2 from Hashem himself. Why? Because these 2 first bullet points include all the Torah. But Abish said, of that included all the positive commandments. And there should not be to you other gods. That includes all of the negative commandments. Kizehu seder nitinas haTorah, because this is the way you give over Torah. Shahaskalasahi ba'amiras haklalim Rashi Devarim shebehem nechlalim kol hapratim. First, you give the headline, you give the generality, you give the basic overarching schema, which includes all the details. And then you go into details. And the Rebbe says in brackets, and it could be that there are other people that no, I'm sorry. I mixed it up. What's coming? It's something that's coming up. There could be people here who remember the Rebbe saying it, but it's not this bracket. And based on this, we could understand what the Chachamim taught, and Rashi brings down that first, the Eibusher gave all the Aseres HaDibros in one utterance. And then all the Dibros were repeated, each one individually. Shechazar, he repeated, Uperish al kol dibur v'dibur b'fnei atzmai. Each one was articulated separately. And the Rebbe says, it seemingly, this is a wonder. Kevan shechazar uperish kol dibur b'fnei atzmai, ma tam hutrach la'imram tchila b'dibur echad, ma she'ena eizin yichel l'shmaya. If you're going to list the Aseres HaDibros, each one individually, what's the reason you have to put them all in one dibur? And human beings are not capable of hearing 10 different messages, all inter-included in one. The Rebbe says, but this was the stage that the Eibusher set up for giving the Torah. You start with the great axiom or the axiomatic idea, Kol HaTorah Kula. Shekol HaTorah Kula Hirak Dibur Echad. That in truth, all of Torah is one utterance. And only after you have that point of departure, then it emerges Baha Pirut Torah. Then comes the detailed and the delineated of the Torah. Tchila Laser Sadibers. First, it's subdivided in 10 utterances. Kol Dibur B'fnei Atzmai, each one separately. Va'achar Kach, and then it's further subdivided L'Taryag mitzvahs to 613 mitzvahs. Ubazeh Gufa, and in that separation, Ribui Pratea mitzvahs, and you have subsidiary aspects of each mitzvah. Ad, and the Rebbe here is quoting from Shir Hashirim, Va'alamais ein mispar. Literally, it means there's an infinite number of maidens. But of course, this is understood to be talking about that there's an infinite number of subsidiary aspects to each mitzvah. Now the Rebbe is saying, V'zeu achiluk bein Rashi Devarim shebemechilta l'Rashi Devarim shebemidrash. Now let's circle back and let's see who is saying what. Because they're broadcasting a totally different message when they say that the women got the Rashi Devarim. B'shneihem medubar bichlal shebetayra. Both are saying that Rashi Devarim means the generalities of Torah. Ela shebemedrash koi bichlale haTorah shehem hanashim yichayles lishmaya. But the Medrash is addressing this in terms of what a woman could receive, what she could hear. Hainu, Dvarim Ksarim Shatalmid Yachol Lekabel. Okay, so this is going according to the first way of understanding Rashi Dvarim, that the teacher has to simplify it and has to put it in succinct form so it doesn't overwhelm. The Rebbe says, Hainu Dvarim Kitsarim. Words that are short, Shatalmid Yachol Lekabel, that the student is going to be able to receive. Techevan, why did this have to be for women? Shenashim Da'atan Kitsara, which trigger warning should not be conflated with Da'atan Kalois, which we're not going to address. But here we're saying the Rebbe is saying Da'atan Kitsara, which seems to mean shorter attention span. Lachen, lahen, therefore you say to them, rak rashi devarim v'loy riboy hadiktukim. So you give them just the basic, bullet points rather than all the detail. But the Rebbe says, v'ilu rashi devarim b'mechilta. But when the Mechilta uses the term Rashi Devarim, Hainu Rashi Devarim Be'etzem. This is it's using the term Rashi Devarim as the essentials. Klale HaTorah, it's talking about imparting the essential, the most concentrated aspect of Torah. Shemehem Mistafim Kol Protei Torah. And all the details kind of branch out from that. Everything gets extrapolated. And according to the Mechilta, it's dafka women to whom it's shayach to give over and impart the essence, the most concentrated form from which everything else emerges. So, according to the Medrash, give it to the women in shortened form, in synopsized form, so they're not overwhelmed and can grasp what they can grasp. According to the Mechilta, give it to them, giving them the essence from which they will be able to extract everything that needs to come out of it. That's Gimel, Dalet. Al Piza Nimtza. So once we understand this, we find sheyesh hebdel yisoidi bein hamechilta v'hamedrash v'oifen shaychusam shel nashim ledivrei Torah. There is a very, very basic undergirding differentiation between how the Mechilta and the Medrash see the relationship and the relevance of Torah to women. Laha Medrash nitan lenashim Rak mashehim yicheles l'shmaya. From the perspective of the Medrash, women were given, remember, the Medrash was the one that was underscoring mashehim or mashehin, yicheles or yichelen l'shmaya. Meaning, hainu rak hadvarim hashayachim lahen. What was imparted to the women? What is relevant to them in terms of mitzvahs? Masha inki la mechilta. But in contradistinction, according to Mechilta, shaloi niskar hatnai shehim yicheles l'shmaya, he does not include the caveat that what was imparted to them is what they're able to receive. Hari adarabba. On the contrary, nitan lenashim ha'etzem shel Torah klaleha. It's the opposite. Women were giving everything. They were given the essence, and everything is included in the essence. The Torah and all of her rules. Rashi Devarim Shemehem Mistafim Hatiktukim Shenemru La'anashim. All the details that branch off of the basics of the bullet points that were given to the men. V'yishleimer. And we might say, Sheish Bezet Nafkamina Le'inyan Mitzvahs Asei Shazman Grama Shenoshim Peturis Mehen V'chein Talmud Torah Shenoshim Peturis Mitzvahs Talmud Torah. And the Rebbe says that we can infer that this difference really relates to the fact that women are patur, they are exempt from mitzvah seishas grama, from positive commandments that are time-bound, and also that the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is something that women are exempt from. They're not exempt from learning Torah that is necessary to do the mitzvahs practically, and the Rebbe taught that they're not exempt from learning the parts of Torah that inspire them to love the Eibishter and to fear Hashem and so on and so forth, all the mitzvahs to medias. But they don't have the mitzvah of V'yigisem b'yom v'layla to toil in Torah day and night. Again, that has to do with time. So, Lefi hamedrash milachatchila le'nitnu lahen inyan hamela. So according to the Medrash, women were not, to begin with, they were never given information about these things from which they are exempt. Hainu, she'ena mitzvah salein klal, ki lo nitan lehen ela ma shehem yicheles l'shmaya. They were never commanded to do these things because that doesn't go into the category of what they're able to hear. Ma she'enkin lehamechilta, but in contradistinction, according to the Mechilta, Kevan shenitan lehem rashi dvarim. The Mechilta says they were given rashi dvarim from the perspective of they were given the essence. The essence includes everything within it. Dahainu, this means klale kol haTorah kula. They were given the bullet points about the entire Torah. Harei shayachas heina l'chol haTorah kulam. This means that they are shayach to the whole Torah. In other words, our point of departure is that the whole Torah is relevant to women. The fact that they're exempt is like the Rebbe saying it's a technicality. In terms of their observing it practically, they're exempt. But in terms of its relevance to them, it's relevant. Aval nestinas haTorah mitzvoseh, harikol haTorah mitzvoseh, gam mitzvoseh shazman grama, nitnu gam lenashim. The entire Torah was given to women, all of the mitzvahs, inclusive of the mitzvah seishas man grama, all of it was given to women. V'zeh she'einu chayavas b'asiyasan, einay mema'ed klal b'hanasina b'hakabbalah. The fact that they don't have a chiyuv, or that women have an exemption from mitzvah seishas man grama, this does not detract at all from their having been given the entire Torah, from them having received the entire Torah. One of the big mazel tovs of today is that yesterday was a siyum on Kol HaTorah Kula, and a lot of women, of course, do a Sefer HaMitzvahs. Some women do Perek Echad. The Rebbe even spoke about the possibility of women doing Shlosh Prakim. But the point is, from the Rebbe's perspective, the entire Torah is relevant to women. This is the part that I actually remember the Rebbe saying that This will be more readily understood and sweetened by referencing what the Arizal taught. Sheba'asais hazachar es hamitzvah, ein mehatzer shegam hanashim ta'asena levada. When a man does a mitzvah, there's no need for the women to do that mitzvah. Because she's already included with him in the time that he does that mitzvah. But that's not true for mitzvahs loisaseh, for negative commandment. And Barizal finishes that teaching. I'm sorry. And this is the secret of what the Chachamim taught, Ishtay kegufay damya, that his wife is like his body. And like it says also in the Zayar, Sha'ishva Isha, that the man and woman, Kol echad la'atzmai, each one by themselves, who plag gufa is only half of a body. V'inyan zehu, and this inyan is huloi rak b'nashim nisuyeh, and this does not only apply to married women, elagam b'nais Yisrael shaloi nisu adayan, but it also applies to young women who are not yet married. Because a man and woman together are one neshama. But when they're separated, they're only half of a body. So even before they are joined, the two halves, meaning before marriage, what the man does aids and assists his other half, the woman to whom he will be married in the future. Hey, al pizeh yesh levar hatam sharak b'mechilta makdim b'loshen raka. Once we understand all of this, now we can understand why the mechilta uses the term and prefaces with the term loshen raka. Masha inkein b'medrash, the medrash does not use that term. Loshen raka, hainu divrei piyos. Our default understanding of soft language could be words of appeasement or placating, as we said above. V'yesh leimar shekavana lezeh gufa shenemar lahem shein shayachas l'rashi dvarim dahainu de'etzem v'klolei haTorah. Bal pizeh ma shekasav b'mechilta b'loshen raka and more rashi dvarim hainu shamiras rashi dvarim zehu aloshen raka u'deloi kinal siif aleph. Now this is something so subtle and beautiful here. He says that the Mechilta uses the term Lashon Raka, soft language, because he's the one that's saying that women get Rashi Dvarim, they get the entire essence. And this is the Lashon Raka. This is the words of appeasement, as it were, but it's a different level of appeasement. In other words, we started in Sif Aleph with thinking that words of appeasement are that you tell them about the schar, you don't tell them about the harsh punishments, etc., etc. But here the Rebbe is saying, what's the Lashon Raka? What the Mechilta is being Mechadesh, that women get the entire essence. V'lachein, v'hamechilta shebeseja zeni keres mailas hanoshim ala anoshim. So for the Mechilta, who in this order appreciates and recognizes what women bring to bear that is different than men. Shirak lahem oimim rashi dvarim klalei haTorah. That is only to the women that they get the essence, because they can understand what comes out of that essence. Lachein mudgash b'mechilta she'amar l'nashim b'lashon raka. Hamayla b'nashim ala anoshim. So now we understand why the Mechilta underscores Lashon Raka, soft words. Because what are the soft words? Talking about the Maila, the the exalted properties of women as opposed to men. Masha enkein laha medrash ulahefach. But in contradistinction, the medrash is actually underscoring the opposite. That when it says it's the other way of understanding Rashi Dvarim. It's about constricting and constraining and devolving and bringing it down and simplifying the words for women. Why? You don't reveal to them the words like the divrei Torah, the words of Torah, like you do to men, because they're not capable of absorbing all of that. The Rebbe says that's why the Medrash doesn't use the term lashon raka. And based on this, we can understand the rest of what the Medrash says. That after this, that the Rebbe had brought down in the beginning of the Sikh of the Medrash, Mamshich, over there the Medrash continues and says, Davar Acher, another thing, Lama Lenashim Tchila, Shehain Mizdarzois B'mitzvahs. Why was it, in fact, that the Torah was given to women first? Why does it say, and then only B'sagid Livnei Yisrael? Because women act with alacrity to do mitzvahs. They act speedily. In other words, the Medrash is coming to answer a question. Why should women get the Torah first? So according to the Medrash, women's ability to hear and to absorb Torah is not equal to men. It has to be simplified for them. It has to be synopsized for them. So why should they get the Torah first? So the Medrash is coming to say, because they act with greater speed and alacrity and zrizus than do men. Because it's not understood. The perish aleph loiniska klal al derech hakdamas nashim la'anashim. Umay kavanas hamedrash davar acher lama lenashim tchila. This medrash does not delineate that the women got it before the men. But then in the davar acher, he says, why did the women get it first? So based on what we've explained, we could say shekavanas hamedrashi, that the medrash is coming to explain shahakoshi beperish aleph b'medrashu, what I just said before, that the problem with the first part of the medrash is that if you're going to assert that women's understanding in Torah is inferior to men, because you only tell women what they're capable of hearing, which is less than the men. So why are women getting the Torah first? That there's another Indian, there's another concept, and it is for that second concept that women got the Torah first. And what is that concept? That women act with alacrity when it comes to mitzvah. But if you go back to the Mechilta, to the second part of the Mechilta, Asi Shapi B'Pashtus, Tamak Damas Nashim La'anashim, then it's very, very clear and it's very simple why women got the Torah first. Kizehu Seder Nesinas Divrei Torah, because that's the way you impart Torah. Shebetchila Ba'im Klalei HaTorah, Rashi Dvarim. First, you give the generalities, which women, according to the Mechilta, can grasp and understand everything from that short-coded, very, very concise and terse presentation, but they can pick it apart by themselves. Just like the Rebbe explained, Aser Dibros was first. All 10 Dibros were given in one Dibra, and then each one was separated. Vav. Amnam Zet Tzarech Bir. Now this requires explanation. Why does the Mechilta? Okay, so we understand what the Mechilta is opining, but the Rebbe says, but why? What drives the Mechilta to say that generalities, without all of the extrapolation That's something that correlates with women over men. V'yesh leimar, the Rebbe says we might say, shezeu behetem l'mayla klala shematzinu b'nashim legabe anashim be'inyan avodas Hashem b'chlal. We might say that this aligns with a superior characteristic that we find generally by women vis-a-vis men in their avodas Hashem. Dehine, anurayim, we see she'etzel nashim yesh yoser begilui emuna b'Hashem v'yiras Hashem. We see that women have, in more revealed fashion, emuna in Hashem and yiras Hashem, faith in God and awe of God. She'af she'atam lazeh begolui hu lefi she'ein sichlam chazak kol kach shelachein krevim yoser lekabel be'emuna pshuta ba'oises b'li chakira. The Rebbe says, you might say that in overt or revealed form, the reason why you see more emuna and yiras shamayim by women is because their intellect is not as strong, and so it is easier for them. They are closer to accepting what Hashem says with simple faith, and to do it without analysis and rumination and etc. etc. But the Rebbe says that's bigolui, that's the reveal. But the Rebbe says the deeper reason is what's the source of the reason that women have greater emuna and yiras Hashem? Because by women, the emunah in Hashem is illuminated as it is above by Hashem. Shemitam zeh chiluk be'inyan hayachas she'etzem uchlalos Yisrael tolui dafka beha'ein. We might say that for this reason, we see a very important difference between men and women halacha. That the essence and the general identity of a Jew depends on who the mother is. Shahanoilad la'em Yisraelis habe Yisrael. Gam k'sha'av ena Yehudi. That if a person is born to a Jewish mother, they are Jewish, even when the father is not Jewish. V'rak hapratim v'achilukim b'vnei Yisrael gufa. And it's only the details and the distinctions, like Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael, that tluyim b'mishpachas ha'av. That is attributed based on the patrilineal side. But the essential identity is matrilineal. And because the Torah mitzvahs were given to dafka specifically to Jews, so Torah mitzvahs were given to the Jews. Therefore, the purpose of the Jews. So therefore, since the identity of the Jew depends on the mother, so then the just like the essence of the identity belongs to the mother, the essence of the Torah is given to women. Rashi Devarim, the basics, Shehem Shayachim, La'emuna b'Hashem v'yiras Hashem. The essence of the mitzvah is about emunas Hashem and yiras Hashem. Shehem klal kol Torah kula, because that's the overarching or the undergirding axiom of the whole Torah. Ubulashon hakasuk, and the words of the pasuk in Parshas V'eschanan, Vayetzavenu Hashem la'asais eskol hachukim ha'ela leyiras Hashem. Hashem commanded us to do all of these statutes for the purpose of fearing Him or being in awe of Him. That's the mother. Ulaha'av shebai tluyim hachilukim v'dargas pratis Yisrael, and in regard to the father, upon whom are dependent the distinction and the different categories, the specific categories, like the Rebbe said earlier, Kayin Levi Yisrael, nitnu loy b'miyuchad hadikdukim pratim to Torah mitzvahs. So the men were given the details of Torah mitzvahs. V'yish leimar, and we might say, shezeh gufa hatam shehanashim p'turas mikiyum mitzvah seishas man grama. We might say that this is the reason why women are exempt from positive commandments that are time-bound, keep a mitzvahs gufa, because in mitzvahs themselves, hare, mitzvahs loisase, or mitzvahs she'ein hazman grama, loy nimshechu bo b'proteg bolas hazman, kim mitzvahs hazman grama. Because when it comes to mitzvahs loisase, or the mitzvahs that are not time-bound, they did not come down into this world within the constriction of the rubric of time. And therefore, nashim liyaisim shayachis beyichud lichlal ha'torah v'mitzvahs chayavas rak b'mitzvahs loisaseh mitzvahs she'ein hazman grama. Therefore, women who are shayachas to the unified essence and basics of Torah are only obligated in that kind of mitzvah, which transcends the constriction and the constraint and the limitations of time. And we might be able to say, when the Rizal says that it's not necessary for women to do these mitzvahs by herself, because she's already included in him, in her husband, when he does a mitzvah. Ha'pa'ula b'frote hagbalas hazman shayach lepagufa hasheni chelek hazachar shel haneshama. Because enmeshing yourself or involving yourself in the details of the constrictions and the limitations of time, this is relevant to the male aspect of the neshama. And the Rebbe concludes, the Navi Micha says that just like in the days of Mitzrayim, when Mashiach comes, I will show you wonders. The Kashem Shehaya B'Yetzias Mitzrayim Shebeschar B'Schus Nashim Tzidkani Sheba'isa Adar Nigalu Yisrael Mitzrayim. Just as we know, the Gemara in Saita tells us that it was in the merit and it was a reward for the righteous women of that generation that our forefathers were, that Klal Yisrael were redeemed from Egypt. And it's through them, because they were able to leave Mitzrayim, they were able to receive the Torah. Because the stated mandate of leaving Mitzrayim was to be able to serve Hashem on that mountain. So it is in the forthcoming Geula, that is the merit of the righteous women, that we will leave this galus, and will be zeiche to learn the Torah Mashiach. Mashiach will teach the whole nation, men and women, limiktanam ba'ad g'delam, from the youngest to the oldest, from the smallest to the greatest. Shalimuda yeh ba'ifin shel re'iyah. And when Mashiach teaches Torah, it's going to be in a way where you could see what he is teaching. Yilamed haklal gadol shebetayra. He's going to teach the great axiom of Torah, which is all about Amun Hashem, Yirat Hashem, V'yadua shelasid yizgala etzem pnimius haTorah. And it's well known that in the future, the essence and the innermost aspects of Torah will be revealed, and should be b'mehera v'yameinu mamash. It should be speedily in our days, literally. That